So recording has begun, and this is our Bible study, and we have been in Genesis, and we're back looking at the text and some of the, shall we say, some of the more obvious theological implications of the text in Genesis 2, and a couple of things that are very significant here. Perhaps, Rebecca, we had a situation with someone who has actually attended another school and has taken a course in Genesis, and I think we could probably describe that without being too pointed, could we not?
I think so.
So, at any rate, this person was attending or attends another school, and they were teaching about Genesis. And in the teaching about Genesis, one of the things that came up was that this idea of the nature of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and why God had placed it in the garden. And that it was the basic concept is God had placed it there, and it was kind of a prohibition, but it was I guess should say a probationary thing. It was a test of humans to see if they would follow God's design or not. And so when this person began to express that, and part of the teaching was that it seemed to center on the idea that God put the tree in the garden to test the humans, Adam and Eve, to see if, essentially, I guess, if they were ready for the next stage, that eventually he would let them eat of the tree when they got to a certain point, or when the whole creation gets to a certain point of maturity, he would let them eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And I commented to this person that I said that is not a valid teaching from that passage. It is not what the scriptures are actually saying. And one of the things that I pointed out to this individual myself was that consider if God, and see so many of these things go back to knowing God as he has revealed himself. And part of that is knowing that he does not change, knowing that he cannot be false, knowing that he cannot misrepresent himself in any way to any degree. And so, this idea that he can't change, and there's so much of scripture that supports that concept. But I asked the individual that I said, now, if God said at one point in time to man, thou shalt not eat of this tree, for in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. And then later, he's going to change and say, thou mayest now eat of the tree. And I said, when does God ever change? And the person said to me, said, well, never. And I said, that's right. God doesn't change. I said, but now, if he said, thou shalt not eat of the tree, and then later he says, thou shalt eat of the tree, because you see, thou shalt not eat of the tree was that's an expression of his design. And because his design is an expression of his person, it is to be identified with his person. His design is not some external thing, like I would design a system as an engineer and it's external to me. So it's not really a part of me in that sense. But God's design, when he expresses these things, they are part of his nature. They come from his nature and his person. That's why his design is so simply perfect. And so if he said, thou shalt not eat of the tree, and he has a purpose in doing so, and that is an expression of his person, and then later he says, thou shalt eat of the tree, that's a contradiction in his person, and there can be no contradiction, no change in his person. So that means that cannot be an understanding of that passage, and we're dealing with that somewhat today, right now. But this person said, well, if he was just giving them a test, well, it doesn't matter what humans think of it. And by the way, you're going to see the eating of the tree was not a test, or the prohibition against eating of the tree was not a test. And consider this: if God is God, as he is, and if he knows all things from the beginning, and he knows not only what is going to happen, but he knows all the potentialities of what could happen, and he does, because he built the system, then how can it be that he would give man a test? Is it a test for man to see that there's something wrong with him? That's not the idea. Man didn't need a test like that. And we talked about it some last week, and we're going to go more into it. So it was not a test. It was a prohibition. There was something related to it in terms of knowledge, and we'll talk about that now. But let's go now into this. We were in this document last week, and I want to go here with, by the way, it says you're presenting to everyone, so everybody needs to know. I'm presenting to everyone. Very good. All right, just a quick rehash of this thing. This was where we had from Genesis 3 and 4, that where God gave the prohibition of the fruit of the tree in the midst of the garden. God has said, you shall not eat of it, and Eve added, neither shall you touch it. But the original prohibition had been back in 2, where God had said to the man, the Adam, and he told him, of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, thou shalt not eat of it, and for in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. So, and we've talked some about death already, and death is not death as we think of death in our vernacular after 6,000 years of death and suffering in the world. It's what Adam thought of death, because Adam was talking to God, communicating with God at that time, and this was still on the 6th day of creation, because Eve had not yet been created, and she would be created on that 6th day. And thus, when you think about it, then Adam's understanding of death, the death that he would experience, was the understanding that God intended him to have. And thus Adam's understanding of death was God's meaning, as God intended man to understand that death of which he spoke. It was not, okay, Adam, you're going to experience 6,000 years of death and suffering, and you're going to have all this experience, and you're going to have a knowledge of death that's going to make death a terrible, terrible. That wasn't there. It had not happened. So when we looked at 2:15, and let me go up here just a little bit to see something else. Okay. And from last week, I've even added a couple of points into the material here. But think about this. So we're going to look at God's impartation of his design to Adam. Consider everything that God said to Adam, everything that he told him, positive, negative, whatever, everything that he built into him was an expression of God's design for humanity. And if that's not true, then we don't have a clue what happened when God brought humans into existence, or even if he did. So God's impartation of his design to Adam. When the Lord God created his first Adam, he placed him in the garden and gave him instructions regarding how he was to function and interact with everything there. And someone has been editing, and they left a little bit of text there unnecessarily. So Adam, that first Adam, recorded his perspective of the nature of his placement and the instructions he received from the Creator. So this is Adam's perspective of his placement in the garden and and what the instructions were like that he was receiving. See, we think of instruction now and we grate against it. That's because we have this, as we call it, a fallen nature and that propensity to violation. But it was, or all this placement and the instructions, the nature of all of this, it was like the Creator himself, perfect, just as Adam expressed it in his original perfect language. And this is what he said, verse 15. Then Yihye Elohim took the Adam, then he, and I supplied the subject there, then Yihye Elohim caused, now and this is important, he caused the resting of him in the Garden of Eden to serve it and to keep it. And if you sometime want to do an interesting study, you ought to look at how many times the word Eden is used in scripture, and you'll notice there are places where the triliteral root of Eden, and you can see it down here in the Hebrew text, Eden, and it is used as a name a number of times, and it also has a triliteral, that triliteral root, ayin daleth nun, has a verbal use as well. So, and it is pointed differently when it is when it changes, but it basically relates to something that would be delightful. It's extremely enjoyable, something of that nature. So this garden was indeed, it was the garden of God for sure. But so he took him, and you notice the descriptive literal translation, and here's the verb, Wayanakehu. It's not that God just put him in the garden. Now I understand earlier the text, and I think it's 2:7, says that God put him in the garden. Okay, but here you get another expression of that, and it's a broader expression. This is the verb nuach, or the very same word from which we get the name Noach, and it means to rest. And it is in this case, as Rebecca was explaining about some of those verb aspects and such, the stems, this is in a hiphil, and it's a hiphil imperfect, while consecutive on it, but it means, literally it means he caused him to rest. There's a pronoun on the end of this, and that's a third masculine singular pronoun. So he caused him to rest. So thus, if Adam is the author of these first 4 chapters, and the more I study this text, the more I am confident that Adam, I don't know if I could become more confident, but I am confident that Adam is the writer, the original writer of the first 4 chapters of Scripture. Then you begin to interpret as this man would have written them in his time, not how they would have been written down or transferred to someone else and transferred, and then somebody else writes it down some 2,000 plus years later, but as this man would have written in his terminology, from his perspective. So he is writing, and he is saying that God called Yihye God. Wait a minute. You know what? If he said Yihye God, he used the actual name that God gave to Moses another 2,700 years later. Exodus 3:14. So could it be that Adam knew God as the God who exists? I don't think we didn't do that paper on, did we do the paper on the name of Yihye? Yihye. I think we did that way back.
I think we did.
We did a couple of months ago. So this is one of those places where he used the name of God, and that's the way he knew him. By the way, that would mean that the name Yihye for God, or what we call Yahweh or Jehovah, whatever, but as a name, that name existed from Adam. It existed from Adam all the way. It was not developed by some later individuals. And just as the word Elohim did not develop as a plural of majesty of later individuals, it would have been a plural of majesty of the first man himself. So he even calls God here in this 2nd chapter, Yihye Elohim. And he says of God that God took the Adam, speaking of himself, and he caused the resting of him in the Garden of Eden to serve it and to keep it. So now, let's look a little bit farther here. Adam recorded several aspects of God's instruction, but not all of them. The volume of that instruction for the first man far exceeded the ability of a finite being to record. But, like the God who gave it, it was perfect in its every aspect. To Adam, every aspect of his Creator's instructions would be important, but not every aspect needed to be recorded in the document Adam was providing. Many aspects would relate to natural practices clearly understood to be the design of God for his life functions, and others would relate to activities assigned to Adam, such as dressing and keeping the garden. Certainly, the Creator built into Adam many of the basic design criteria associated with living as he was designed to live. But the record also indicates that some information was communicated directly, perhaps in the form of oral instruction even, and obviously so, after God brought him into existence. God had designed man to receive information, to retain it, and to correlate it properly in order to reach conclusions and make decisions in keeping with the Creator's design. So you remember, and we talked about this a little last week, the prominence of a single criterion in Adam's memory. So Adam knew the criteria of God's design for his existence, and he would carry throughout his life not only that knowledge, but also the distinct remembrance of the one criterion, that first criterion he had violated. That experience of violation, with its incomprehensibly undesirable result, would elevate that first sin to a position of primary significance. Thus, when he inscribed the record of the incident which had brought death and suffering into the world, his focus was not upon the broad range of criteria which he might have violated. It was upon the one criterion he had actually violated, the criterion which had prohibited eating from the tree. This was not the only instruction he had received, neither was it the only prohibition he had received. Indeed, keep in mind, every positive instruction includes inherent with it an unstated prohibition against not doing the positive instruction. Eating from the tree was the only point of instruction, whether positive or negative, he had violated. And we know we're going to talk more about why he ate. So he could have violated any other criterion of God's design, but he did not violate any other criterion. He violated only this one: from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat. This criterion of God's design took on a singular importance in the mind of Adam, because it was his violation of this singular criterion that alienated him from his Creator. It was his violation of this singular criterion that ended the glorious existence he had lived before that moment when his single willful choice to act outside the Creator's design would change everything. Now, also, God's purpose in the design and statement of the prohibition. God did not have to learn of man's sin after the fact. He knew it in detail even before he created the man. As Creator, he fully understood the nature he had built into man, including how man could and would misuse that which he had received. Thus, the prohibition was not in any way a test for his human creatures. The result of Adam's violation would, for the remainder of time, express to every human the irreplaceable value of God and conformity to his perfect design, thus increasing human understanding of the person and nature of the Creator. You see, when you see the evil, you see these results of violation, you understand the nature of the Creator even better, not saying, well, he's allowing violation. No, he's built that system so that when evil occurs and we experience, it is designed to accomplish a purpose. And that purpose is as we've talked about, Rebecca, we've talked about it multiple times, that two-headed arrow. If you do good, you get good, so to speak. This is extreme simplification of that illustration. It's in another paper in Biblical Theology OT. But it's, if you do good, you get blessed ultimately. And good is the criteria of God's design, conformity to. If you do evil, you get ultimately destruction, the lake of fire, that kind of thing. But so among the criteria of God's original design expressed to Adam, the prohibition against eating of the tree stands out. Though it may not have been the only verbalized prohibition, it certainly was a prohibition that was expressed in a manner that might be misinterpreted if viewed from the wrong perspective. Eve was deceived into adopting that perspective, but Adam, in his role as the head over creation, needed no deception. That's the way we are as men. You don't need to deceive us. We'll just decide to do wrong on our own. He could reason and discern for himself that there was something more available to him, something within his ability to possess, but which the Creator had placed off limits for no apparent reason, except that he would surely die. You've got to remember, death has not occurred. There is no experiential knowledge of death when God says this to Adam. God had warned Adam of this consequence, but death from Adam's perspective did not carry the same significance the word would bring to mind after 6,000 years of its effects. Unquestionably, God knew that stating a condition of his design for Adam in the form of a prohibition, which in its very statement seemed to indicate that a higher level of knowledge, a greater degree of authority was within Adam's reach, but prohibited from him, that would incite man's ability to imagine this new state of existence. That would be the test. Would man, with the image and likeness of the Creator working within him, cause firmness to the criteria established for him, or would he cause firmness to the reasonings and formings of his own mind, extrapolated into the realm of authority, properly understood and managed by the Creator alone? Adam chose the latter. He chose to extrapolate his authority into a realm that had never been delegated to him. And that's what he did. But it wasn't a test. God had known that this would happen, but it demonstrates, what gets me when I think about this, because I think of the times when I have overseen the work of other men, and especially when we had a design that we were supposed to be working on, and we would be designing this new system, and I'd have multiple engineers working under me doing things, and most of them were lost. They hated one another sometimes so badly that they couldn't stand to work together. And yet I would take two men and I would say, you are the best ones to do this, and you will do this together, and you will work together, and you will not have conflicts with one another. You will do this together, or you won't be here after the project is done. Plain and simple. They were going to follow the criteria of my design, or they wouldn't be a part of the project. I would have, as we would say, all I had to do was send them back to the office, the consulting firm's office. And when they would go back to the office, if there was no work for them, they would be laid off. I wouldn't have to fire them. I'd just send them back to the office. And that happened. And I did that with an electrical engineer. And when he got back to the office, they sent him right out the door. He was gone. And you could say, well, you fired him? Why would you do it? Well, it's because he refused to conform himself to criteria that I deemed necessary to complete the project properly. The man was not going to deter the completion of the project. He would suffer from his own choices because he refused to cooperate in certain matters, but the project was going to be successful nonetheless. Now, if I could do that with a human engineering project, what could the Creator of all that exists do with his project to reveal himself and for man to see him as he is. Well, Adam's choice of extrapolating his mind into a realm of authority that he did not possess, had never been delegated to him, that did not in any way turn aside the design. God's design was still going to work perfectly. So the violation, not the tree, was the issue. Now, we talked about this a little bit, but it's not the tree. Everybody focuses on the tree. It's not the tree. And I was reading some in Gerhardus Voss' book on biblical theology, and he speaks of the tree, and it's hold just a minute. Hold right where you are. I'm learning that this book that has been used in so many different schools through the years, Gerhardus Voss, Biblical Theology, there's his name at the bottom of the page too. The book that I used, it was used at Temple Baptist Seminary, Maranatha, Bob Jones, and I don't even know where else, probably just about everywhere else. But as he talks about these different things, he uses this talking about the tree, and he's talking about its symbolism, that the tree has a symbolism. He doesn't approach it as though the tree is more of it's an absolute reality in physical existence, but he's talking about the tree and the nature of the description of it. And he does the same kind of thing when he gets to the principle of temptation and sin, symbolized in the serpent. Well, and from what I can understand, he does believe there was a tree, there was a serpent. The serpent was used by a demonic person and all of that. But still, the way these things are expressed, it's like, wait a minute, we're not just dealing with something that's symbolic here. This was something that either it did happen or it did not happen. And either Adam's record of it is accurate or Adam's record is not accurate. And so, with respect to the tree, certainly if the man had chosen to violate any other aspect of God's design, the same alienation would have occurred. Though the tree was significant in Adam's account because it was that specific tree which had been involved, the tree was not the issue in God's sight. Adam made this clear when he recorded the Lord God's reason for expelling him from the garden. There, in that record, the Lord did not refer to the tree from which man ate. He spoke only of the result of man's having eaten. The issue with God was not the specific design criterion Adam violated. The issue was Adam's choice to supersede his creator's design with criteria of his own design. Indeed, the tree was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, in that the prohibition against eating from it was a criterion of God's design, the violation of which would usher Adam into a new relationship with the design of God. So then we have the existence of evil in relation to the pronouncement of good. And this is an important point to keep in mind. Adam already knew good and evil. Think about it. When God said, this is what you are to do, and with the implication that if this is what you are to do, there's also the potential of violation of evil if you do not do it. That was, Adam would know good because that's what God said. God said it, that was good. And he would know evil by what God said. He could learn without having to experience. He could learn it by taking God at his word, at the very expression of his revelation of himself and his design. And so Adam knew good and evil because the criteria of the Creator's design were the criteria of good and evil. This truth is rooted in the nature of God, in that when God expresses any criterion of his design, he is expressing a criterion of good. At the same time, when he expresses good, the existence of that good presupposes the potential, to the degree that he sees fit, for a contrasting condition and opposite condition to exist, the criteria of which are not in accord with the good expressed. That is, the establishment of criteria defined as good brings into existence at the same time the potential for non-good, the contrast of good, that which is called evil. It's just like when a parent would say to a child, okay, son, take out the trash. That, by the authority of the parent in the situation, that is the definition of good. And when the child then goes ahead and takes out the trash as he is supposed to do by the design of the parent, the authority in the matter, then the child has done good and may expect a reasonable reward in the relationship that he has with his parent. But if the child says, no, I'm not going to take out the trash, I'm just not going to do it, that's a potential case that can exist, because good has been expressed by the authority, but the potential is that good may not be done. And if the good is not done, it is not a vacuum. There is no such thing as a vacuum as we conceive these things. If the good is not done when it is to be done, then the result of it not being done is evil. And that's a potential whenever you express a positive criterion. When I built systems, when I designed and built engineering systems, and they were installed, and I gave a design, my design was good. I designed it, I planned it, I worked through it, and then we built the system, and then I give it to the operators with operating instructions, and the operators go down. Very first time an operator goes down, he goes down and he says, well, this thing doesn't work. And I said, well, did you do this and that? And he said, well, no, I didn't do that. I didn't see why you would need to do that. And I said, and see, here is the ignorant. Here's the ignorant evaluating for himself what the person who knew the absolute most about the system, the very designer of the system, the ignorant is evaluating the operational, I guess you'd say, criteria of the system and saying, well, I didn't think that would be necessary. I didn't see why you'd have to do that. Well, I didn't do this. Well, why didn't you do that? Well, did you do this? No, I didn't do that. But, well, so what we did, that very first operator, I said, okay, let's go back right now and let's see if we can do this. And I took him and walked him through the criteria that would be the good conditions. These are the good conditions because the designer of the system had set those conditions to be the way it was to be operated to be successful. And when we took those good conditions and we applied them in the order that they had been designed to be applied, guess what? It worked. And the operator was totally incredulous, could not even believe it, could not understand. Wow, I can't believe that. Wow, that was easy. I thought we've been doing this, and see, that's why I was there. But you know what? When God expressed the criteria of his design, they were good. And then that means there's the potential of evil existing when the good is not present. But there is no vacuum. If good is not present, the criteria of God's design, it's not a vacuum of good or evil. There's a lack of good, which means that evil exists. But if evil does not exist, then that means good exists. So it's an either or thing. It is not a matter of saying, well, I didn't do good, but I didn't do bad either. Oh, yes, you did. Oh, yes, you did. If you didn't do the good, you did the bad. So, and to me, it's extremely simple concept, but be that as it may. So Adam and Eve knew perceptually. They had been taught, they'd been instructed the criteria of good and evil. And they knew experientially the criteria of good, because all the time they're doing that which is in the criteria or in conformity to God's design. They are experiencing and they are doing good, and they are experiencing the result that God designed good to bring in their life. But until the moment of violation of a criterion of the Creator's design, they did not know evil experientially. Now, the violation of a criterion was a violation of the person. Stated differently, and this is why Adam and Eve went and hid when they heard the sound of the Lord going in the garden. Stated differently, the issue was Adam's choice to know both good and evil experientially. Experientially is the key. His Creator had designed him to, listen to this for a second. The Creator had designed Adam to believe, that is, to cause firmness in the revealed design criteria and to live within them. That's what Adam was to do. He did not have to violate and to know that the results of violation were undesirable. He didn't have to learn it experientially. He was to remain perceptually knowledgeable of conditions, potential and impending in the event of violation, but he was to accept the revealed boundaries and not go beyond them. For Adam, and by the way, that word boundary, that I use that word boundary here, it's basically the sense of what the Torah, as we say, we use that word and we translate it law, but there are laws that are absolutely excellent and perfect, even to those of us who like to violate laws sometimes. But that is the basic meaning of the Torah. The Torah was the boundary. It was that expression of the composite, or the composite of all the criterias that were boundaries. So you might say that the law then was the criterion of God, but that criterion is a composite of every aspect that God had designed for everything that exists. So, but he was to accept the revealed boundaries and not go beyond them. For Adam, the choosing to know both good and evil experientially was a choosing to step outside the revealed boundaries, to reject not just the criteria of the Creator's design, but the person of the Creator himself. Because the expression of the Creator is an integral, inseparable aspect of who he is, and it cannot be distinguished from him in any way. So Adam's motivation to violate, it was not by deception. It was not, and we get, by the way, we get all kinds of stupid things that people teach about this, and people say, well, when Eve sinned, and then we're going to put this high moral standard in Adam's violational mind, but we're going to put this high moral standard to it. Well, he realized that then if Eve has sinned, then one day she's going to die, and so he didn't want to live without Eve, so he decides to violate with Eve so they can all die together, and oh, baloney, ungodly. That's theological, but it's wrong theology. It's a theology of a God who does not exist. Adam's motivation to violate was personal volition, not deception. In his first letter to Timothy, the Apostle Paul made clear the fact that Adam was not deceived by the serpent's contradiction of God's design as his woman had been. Adam chose to use the abilities built into, and let me go a little farther here, get down to the next page, by the Creator, and reach a conscious decision to act upon his own assessment of the situation. Whatever the reasoning in his mind, he decided to go beyond the authority he had received, perhaps thinking that the experience of the conditions of the moment was to be preferred over both the good conditions God had established and the evil conditions God had told him would follow such willful choices. For some reason, Adam chose to do his own will. Adam was willing to subject himself to a condition of life he had not experienced for the sake of experiencing a condition contrary to God's design. That was a choice. And by the way, that is why man still has to choose to accept, to believe God, to cause firmness to God's design for man's reconciliation to him. And that reconciliation is through his son. So that's why man has to make a conscious choice. It is not something that is sovereignly bestowed upon individuals who are walking and thinking contrary to the design of God. Adam consciously, willfully violated, and because he consciously, willfully violated, now we all need to consciously, willfully choose to go back to God's design and to walk within it. And that includes the acceptance of his means of reconciliation through his son. So now, let me go up here. I want to see something. We'll just touch on this footnote on 1 Timothy 2:14. Both the Textus Receptus and the majority text of the New Testament use the Greek verb apatao in the two statements describing the non-deception of Adam and the deception of Eve, thus indicating that the concept of deception involved was essentially the same for each, the concept for both of these statements, though certainly in keeping with their created differences as male and female humans. On the other hand, the critical text uses the same verb in the respective locations, but with one addition. So the critical text has an addition to that apatao. That is the verb. So the verb, actually a participle describing the woman's deception, has the preposition ek on the front of it, giving the form ex apatao, thus leading some to the erroneous translation that she was thoroughly deceived. It's not about whether she was thoroughly deceived or unthoroughly deceived. In contrast to the construction indicating that the man was not deceived. So it's like there's this contrast. Eve was thoroughly deceived, ex apatao, but the man was not thoroughly deceived. So he was just deceived. That's not what it's saying. That's not what it says. And the critical text is a wrong reading, and that ek has been added to it. It's kind of interesting. The critical text advocates tend to say, well, the shorter text tends to be the preferred, because they have this concept that the people who modified the text that we now call the Byzantine or majority text or the Textus Receptus, they say, well, they tended to add clarification and things like that. But I can tell you, I can show you places where it is clear that things just like this ek on apatao were added here, just like this. And I can give you explanation as to why it would be added, and there'd be absolutely no sense in leaving it off. And there's no sense in putting it on there unless you're trying to change the meaning of the text. There's a difference. And you look at these, and their evaluation of the text of the New Testament is, I'll just say this. I've been studying the text of the New Testament and I mean with textual criticism, and I've been studying it off and on and teaching through that material for 25 years. And I can tell you, the more I study, the more I am sure that the critical text is the secondary text to what you would either call the Byzantine majority or the Textus Receptus. So that's a little aside that was on there. But the addition of thoroughly to the translation results from interpreting the Greek text from an English mindset. In this case, oversimplifying the function of the preposition to make it no more than an intensifier. Instead of seeking to understand the addition of ek from the perspective of the ancient Greek writer, who would have added this preposition in order to clarify the nature of the deceiving by the basic meaning of the preposition. See, you don't understand the preposition from your modern day concept that you read in a grammar book and says, well, this could be an intensifier. You don't do that. You go back and you say, what would the original writer have done? Why would he have done this? If not the original, then why would a scribe have added it to clarify? What would he intend to do? Or if he left it off, why would he leave it off? If he sees that it needs to be there for clarification or whatever. So properly understood, the preposition adds an adverbial sense to the verb. That is, Eve was deceived out from, that is, deceived out of the boundaries God had set, thus signifying not that she was more intensely deceived than Adam, as though Adam did experience some measure of deception, but that the deception she experienced was sufficient to motivate her to violate God's criteria. Actually, the ek should not have been added to the apatao in the critical text. It only adds to the potential for misunderstanding, though even with it present, such misunderstanding is not justified. And we're gonna leave that there. It just goes into get deeper and deeper. But now, we talked about this. So Adam was willing to subject himself to a condition of life he had not experienced for the sake of experiencing a condition contrary to God's design. Now, Adam's purpose and the specific content of his record. Adam's purpose in recording the event of his violation led him to use very specific wording. Certainly, he did not intend to communicate every detail, but he did intend to communicate every significant detail in order that all his descendants might know the crucial elements of how they came to be in a condition where their very existence began in a state of alienation from their Creator. Adam did not explain away his responsibility in the matter. He was the one whose violation had brought into the world of man all the death and suffering they experienced. His words did not place the blame elsewhere. God had established him as head steward over the creation, and he had violated the criteria of his stewardship. And by the way, that's more. And you wonder if God used holy men of God to write the scriptures, why would he use Adam since Adam violated? He'd used Adam just like he did anybody else. When a man turned back to God and caused firmness in God, just like Abraham did, when a man would cause firmness to God and his design, then God looks at that man and says, righteousness. That's what the scripture says in Genesis 15:6. Righteousness has never been by keeping the law or any criterion. That's what Paul said in Galatians. He did not say that you don't get righteous by keeping by the works of the law. He did not say, Paul did not say the works of the law. Paul said by keeping or conforming to works of law. No article, no thee. That means what Paul was saying was that righteousness does not come by any works of any criterion. You don't do works to get righteous. You believe God, you cause firmness to God, and that brings righteous, because God looks at you and says, because what he thinks in his mind is what he's actually is going on, and he says righteous. So Adam recorded the Lord's reason for prohibiting man from eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. His actual wording of the Lord's statement may be literally translated, dying you will die. The Hebrew construction is a combination of two parts of speech, an infinitive absolute, dying, and a verb in the imperfect aspect, you will die. The actual parsing of the two words is cal infinitive absolute and cal imperfect second person masculine singular, respectively. So now, I guess we could say that Brother Dominguez will know those very well. So the imperfect aspect of the verb signifies incomplete action and could thus be translated into one of several other English forms, dependent upon the context. But here the context requires a translation which indicates the action to be future, because Adam had not violated, so Adam is not dying at the moment. He has not died in the past. He would die conditioned upon the fact that he violated the design of God. So this construction, infinitive absolute plus finite verb, occurs with some degree of regularity in ancient Hebrew, with the infinitive absolute placed either immediately before or immediately after the verb. In these constructions, the infinitive absolute functions as an adverbial modifier to the verb, typically adding some kind of intensification to the verb when the infinitive absolute is before the verb, or indicating duration of the verb action when after the verb. This adverbial, by the way, I don't know if I said that in here, but you need to understand that is a generalization of what the meanings of the location of the infinitive absolute is, because Isaiah does not conform to the general rule. Isaiah does Isaiah. And so, but we'll not go there right now. This adverbial connection effectively makes the two words function as one part of speech, that is, as a verb which has a special aspect of its basic meaning and significance enhanced by the infinitive absolute. The distinction of adverbial sense determined by the location of the infinitive absolute is not always the case. Isaiah did not follow the distinction of meaning as a function of position. This is significant in that this prophet, often called the prince of the prophets, seems to have known every vocabulary word as well as every grammatical and syntactical construction, and how to use them all in a fashion that perfectly communicated his intended messages. Now, let's go to what Satan directly contradicted God's reason for let's see where we at. Okay. The prohibition. When the serpent spoke to Eve, and we've talked about this a little before, but it bears repeating, he did not mince his words, though he wove the exact statement into his conversation about God's instructions. When he addressed the issue of God's reason for the prohibition, he was absolutely direct. When Adam recorded the Creator's reason for the prohibition, he used the infinitive absolute plus the finite verb construction to convey, thou shalt surely die. Literally, dying you will die. Then when Satan contradicted this statement, he used the same exact construction, except for a change of subject from singular to plural, with the addition of the negative lo, no or not, in front of it. That is, he did a negative plus the infinitive absolute plus the finite verb. This placement of the negative before the term being negated is normal Hebrew practice. But the significance here is that Satan could have simplified his wording by leaving out the infinitive absolute. When Eve said that they would die, Eve did not use it in her statement to Satan, but Satan used it thus. So he could have left out the infinitive absolute dying, the word which provided adverbial intensification to the finite verb, you will die, but he did not. Satan's obvious intent was not to simply give an alternate possibility as to what would occur if man ate of the forbidden tree. He intended to directly contradict the wording of the Creator's instruction, God's direct criterion for man's relationship to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Satan, himself a created being like man, placed himself on a level of understanding and authority he did not possess, but presumed to possess. and outwardly indicated himself to possess. He demonstrated himself to be equal with the one who had brought him into existence and endowed him with the abilities he was so greatly misusing. You think about it. He did not just quote what Eve said, he quoted what God said to Adam, and he contradicted what God said. He didn't contradict what Eve said, he contradicted what God said. His only problem was that he could only usurp to himself such a position. It could never be his in truth. Now, the rest of this paper down through here you'll see it has numbers on the paragraphs, and it's somewhat of a restatement of some of the things that were in these previous paragraphs. But there's some additional information here, and I have not correlated all the information totally yet. But let's look at some of this. So, from the moment of God's first instruction to the man knew good. The Creator did not construct his first human creation a blank slate. You'll hear psychologists talk about man, and some psychologists claim that man was a tabula rasa. He was a blank slate upon which life would write all the days of his life. And that is a bunch of absolute stupidity, and it's humanistic absurdity. The Creator did not construct his first human a blank slate upon which only the surrounding creation and his experiences would write. The scriptures give no indication that God brought man, his Adam, into existence as an undeveloped creature which would have to learn to figure out the systems of his environment. Indeed, the clear implication, if not the actual statement of scripture, is that the first man existed not just physically mature, but fully developed in every aspect necessary to function and interact in a thoroughly integral manner with every system of creation which touched upon his existence. Think about it a minute. What part of man was caveman? None. There was no caveman. Caveman came about because people moved around and moved to areas where they did not have the means to withstand the weather or whatever, and they moved into caves which existed. Anyway. The Creator could do no less. By his very nature and relationship to creation, that which he, the infinite God, brought into existence could not be improved or enhanced by the activities of finite creatures in a finite creation. And his creation of the first man was not an exception to this condition. He constructed the Adam complete, capable, not lacking in any characteristic or ability he would need to perform every criterion of his design, including the criterion that he continued to learn as he applied the Creator's design. Think about that. If man had to learn, what good would it do on day 6 for God say that you are, let's see if I can, Peru, Uruvu, Umilu eth haaret, Wukivshua, Urulu. 5 imperatives. If man had to develop all of these things, how could he have understood those things on the very day within hours of his creation? Hours at the most. No implication that it was hours. Doubtless, in the moment after he came into existence. It's just like, it just doesn't make sense. But when you stop and think, this was Adam's record. This is not Moses' wording. This is Adam's wording. Would it be rewritten by Moses? The answer, yes. Because when you look back and you see, consider this, the words of God's revelation, we don't have them written in stone, carved into stone, or in the clay tablets of humans back in the time of Abraham and Job, and even before the flood. We don't have those things. The people of God were not looking to preserve everything in stone, if you will, but they preserved it in writing. That would also imply that they had not only the ability to write, they had the ability to write easily on various materials. They may have even had their own paper. You say, well, they had papyrus. No, I'm not saying papyrus. I'm not saying papyrus. The paper may have been made from papyrus because papyrus lends itself to that sort of thing. But what I'm telling is they were not necessarily limited by modern day technology that says, well, we just started making paper just in the last 100 years. No, or 200, 300, 400, 500 years. When did that knowledge come into existence? It was there in Adam. And Adam would have been able to convey it. I mean, you think about all the workings in iron and brass and everything that these men could do and all the other stuff, even those of the Canaanites. Man was built with everything he needed to do everything that God designed him to do. And if God did not create him that way, then God is not God, but he is. Man then began with knowledge of the Creator's design, and thus he knew good, because the Creator's instructions, regardless of the means by which he communicated them, however they came to exist in the mind of his human creation, those instructions were expressions of his very good design. That is, they were expressions of his person. The nature of God's existence as an unfalse, unchangeable creator made his every expression perfectly representative of his person. The content of his instruction to man, think about this. The content of his instruction to man formed the criteria of his will. You could call it will. His plan, his law for the life of humankind. You could say they were his statutes, his judgments, etc. You could put all of these different words on there that would describe them from various perspectives, but it was still this design, that composite of all the criteria of God's design. They were an expression of his will, his plan, his law, his design for the life of humankind. And that content was good by God's definition, not man's. And man knew this content. Good was not, listen, good was not some ethereal, undefined, or theoretical concept that man knew only by having been told of its existence and which was yet to be perceived by humans. Good was defined by the criteria which God had established to govern his creation. At the moment when God imparted the knowledge of his design to the first man, good existed, and man existed in that good. Nothing existed to obstruct the Adam's experience of God's design. Indeed, good, God's design, was the natural, normal experience of man, and he knew it from both the perceptual knowledge and experiential knowledge perspectives. And by the way, I put in that footnote 4 at the bottom of the previous page, that idea of the tabula rasa. That was the 17th century English philosopher John Locke. He viewed the mind of a newborn child as a tabula rasa, a blank slate, without innate tendencies or criteria for processing information. Accordingly, a person's thinking was formed and developed entirely by his experiences in life. And that is not true. So, let's see. All right. So without question, God communicated to Adam his instructions for the operation of human life, even telling him the result of violating those instructions. But he did not leave his human creation without the ability to perceive that those results bore within them conditions which were totally undesirable. God had made man in his own image, and the reflection of himself that he built into man certainly included the ability to assimilate information, evaluate it, and make decisions accordingly. This was God's design for the life of man, and thus the Creator must have built into man an ability to distinguish between decisions which agreed with God's design and decisions which contradicted his design. That is, man must have possessed from his beginning the ability to discern good and evil, right and wrong. The difference between the Creator and his created being was that God, this is the crucial aspect, man, keep in mind, man must have possessed and did possess from his beginning the ability to discern good and evil, right and wrong. The difference between the Creator and his created being was that God determined right and wrong, whereas man recognized that which God had already determined. Man does not determine good and evil. No angelic being determines good and evil. We recognize that which God has already determined to be good and evil. Man was not designed to be a determiner. He was to be, listen, this is why he was in the image and likeness of God. He was to be a reflection of the determiner, and thus also of what the determiner determined. God designed man to reflect the good that he, the Creator, had established. At the same time, God would also have enabled man to recognize, I was looking away, that the potential existed for him to not reflect the good, thereby bringing into existence a condition which was not good. That is a condition which was evil, a condition that did not coincide with God's design. Regardless of the terminology used, man knew evil, even if only from the perspective that it was potential. Though man had not yet experienced evil, though he did not yet know it from an experiential perspective, man certainly perceived the potential for evil. That is, he knew it perceptually. Thus, Adam knew good both perceptually and experientially, and that he knew evil perceptually, but he did not need experiential knowledge of evil in order to know and discern between good and evil nature of something. So he never needed experiential knowledge of evil to know the difference between good and evil. This is the basic premise of all the revelation of God. And think about this. This is the foundation. Man can and should learn from proper teaching without having to suffer the destruction wrought by violation of the Creator's design. It is also the basic premise of proper teaching in the present day. By the way, as I have said and I've told students so many times, when I learned all the ins and outs of chemical engineering, they did not teach us this is an example of wrong, and this is an example of wrong, and this is an example of wrong. These are examples of things you don't do. They taught us all the things that were according to the way things exist, the way things are designed to interact with one another. They taught us that, and they taught us how to apply it accurately. That's the basic premise of proper teaching today. You don't teach people wrong to get them to do right. For example, a man does not need to commit violations of law in order to know that such violations are wrong and evil. He needs only to receive the teaching of the criteria of the law. God, at least in the matter of eating from one certain tree, had told Adam both sides of the issue. Adam could choose to adhere to the elements of God's design, good, and continue in his unfettered relationship to God, or he could choose to deviate from them, evil, and experience the results of that deviation. In fact, The Hebrew word ra, that's the R's got a little bit of an almost an H sound on the front of it, still in many languages that way. So that ra, which is translated evil in the phrase knowledge of good and evil, is actually the source from which the English word wrong, because when you change the vowel on it from a patak a to an ah, it becomes wrong. And that's where the English word wrong has been transliterated. Came right straight out of that. You ever wondered why it's got a W on the front? It's because it's a resh and not a r, not an R. This word appears to focus on the error aspect of a violation, but it is closely related to another Hebrew word, and that word is evil, which is the source from which the English word evil is transliterated. These words in English come right straight out of the Hebrew text. So the first one is, it seems to focus more on the error aspect of a violation. The second one, evil, this latter word focuses on the aspect of deviation that is extant in any violation. Thus, applying the basic significance of the verb know, Adam and Eve already knew good and evil before they ate of the fruit. The text of Genesis 3, however, seems to indicate that man did not know good and evil prior to the temptation. The difference here is that know in Genesis 3 is qualified. See, grammar matters. Hebrew grammar matters. The difference here is that know in Genesis 3 is qualified by an adverbial phrase in the serpent's statement that Adam and Eve would be knowers of good and evil. And then his adverbial phrase is like gods, not gods, small g. They didn't know small g God, so to speak. But they did know that there was one God, and he was Elohim. And they would be knowers of good and evil like God is a knower of good and evil. That's the significance. It's not just to know good and evil. And by the way, if you go into the book of Gerhardus Voss, his wonderful textbook that we all used, he missed that point totally. That's why you can't go by what a man says. Even Ken Sheets. The authority rests in the word. So that adverbial phrase in the serpent's statement that Adam and Eve would be knowers of good and evil like gods, not gods, small g. Adam and Eve knew only one God, and he is God. No other gods existed. So the comparison Satan set before them was that they would know good and evil as God knows good and evil. Adam was with Eve when Satan put forth his lure, that they could be like their creator, knowers of good and evil. In reality, however, such a condition could never come into existence because man, despite his God-given dominion over the creation, did not possess the authority to affect the standard set by his creator. Man was subordinate to a set of criteria related to good and evil, a set of criteria established external to himself and to which he must look in his evaluations of good evil. That's man must do this. On the other hand, God does not look, shall we say, God does not, let me take a word out there. He does not look at an external source or learn the criteria of good and evil, nor does he look to any standard external of himself. God is the determiner of the standard. That is, he determines what is good and what is evil and imposes those criteria upon his creation because his criteria are perfect. This authority to determine was what Adam chose. This is why Adam violated. This is why Adam was not deceived. Adam chose to usurp to himself an authority that he had never received. It had never been delegated to him. And God is the source of all authority. And you get Romans 13:1 accurate, and you'll understand that. You read the critical text and you read what so many say about it, and you won't understand it. Read it the way God wrote it. This authority to determine was what Adam chose, and what he thought to be doing, even in his choice, contrary to God's revealed design. But this was not what he received. Adam's eyes were indeed opened when he usurped the authority to choose contrary to the will of his creator, but not as he had hoped. His eyes were open to see his choices for good and evil, and to see which choices were good and which were evil according to his own evaluations. But he would no longer see and know evil perceptually only. His experience of violation of God's design had brought him into a new and irreversible perspective, the perspective of experience. Adam would face every future temptation from the perspective that he could never return to the perspective of non-experience. And that perspective would ever be an influence to commit other acts of violation. Adam could determine good and evil for himself, but the nature of his choices was still inexorably determined by the criteria God had established. This was the lure of Satan. This was the lure Satan used to tempt and deceive Eve into violating God's design. And it is what Adam desired when, undeceived, he ate as well. Without excuse, Adam chose to decide good and evil for himself, violating the design criteria that God had already determined. Adam knew good, but perceptually and experientially. And he also knew evil perceptually before ever eating of the forbidden tree. No need existed for him to experience evil in order to know it. He could have believed God. That is, he could have caused firmness to the Creator's design for his existence, thus establishing and maintaining his life upon and within the Creator's design. If he had done so, he could have eaten of the tree of life and lived forever in the garden of God, perceiving only the potential state of existence which would result if he violated, but never knowing that state experientially. And that's the end of that paper. And you're saying, whoo! You're saying, boy, Brother Sheets, that was a lot of reading. Yeah, it was. Do you think it was a lot of reading? You ought to try writing it sometime. You ought to try doing the analysis and then writing it. As they say, you ain't seen nothing yet until you try to write it, until you try to analyze it and write it. That's why you find my typos and little things all through there, and the wording even needs help here and there, needs correlation back to another part. And by the way, editing is a major, major, major time-consuming process. But any questions or thoughts from anyone? We're at our time, so I won't follow up with any more material necessarily.
We have a request for the paper.
A request for the paper. I can do that. I think. Oh, just a minute. Hold on. I'm gonna, before I do anything else, let me save it again. I make changes. Okay, it's now saved. I'm gonna put it onto another place here. I can. My SD card. Yes. So it's saved. Now I can send it.
Who do you send it to?
Okay, I'll just send it. I'll just send it to each one of you then. So
I'll make a list.
Okay, that'd be good. I don't know. Rebecca, I got to tell you, and Jeff, you probably heard me say this too. The more I dig into the text, the more I am displeased with some of the textbooks that we have used in our conservative colleges and seminaries. And then I'm thinking about even how that other individual was led into a wrong concept regarding what happened and why the tree was there and everything.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you think about that view, it was as though it was a test, as though God didn't know what the result of the test would be. So was it a test? And if God did it, and if God's purpose is to reveal himself, then the tree was placed in the garden to be an instrument that would reveal, and the prohibition, it was an instrument to reveal him more clearly, more accurately to his human creations. And it wasn't a test to see if are y'all going to follow me or you're not going to follow me. It wasn't just that simple. So.
I mean, even in the place where we do have the Lord testing Abraham, like there in Genesis 22 that we were looking at earlier, it wasn't that the Lord did not know what Abraham would do, but rather that was an opportunity for Abraham to see more fully what was in his heart with respect to the Lord.
Yeah, God knew that Abraham would teach his descendants properly, even using the word law in that respect. And so he knew what Abraham was going to do. But it's like, in a way, it's kind of like what he did with Job. You think about what he did with Job. Did God not know in an absolute totality that Job would remain faithful to him despite all the things that were going to come upon him? And the answer is yes. Did he not know that Job was not going to understand because all the details of everything that was happening, and that he would, and in his misunderstanding, he would wonder why things were, because he thought he knew God in a certain way, but his knowledge needed to be expanded and clarified. And it wouldn't, and you think about it now, as we've said before, here's Job living before Abraham, and then we have, and Abraham is introduced at the end of the 11th chapter of Genesis. So that means there were 11 chapters of scripture, if you will, that had been written when we have 42 chapters of Job. And that's so short a time after the flood. Why would God do that? See, and those are the questions that I'm trying to get people to see. Ask the questions. Ask why God did this. Ask why God used this word. And don't just go by what your English version says. And you say, well, that's what it means to me. Oh, baloney. It's not what it means to you. It's what God intended it to say and to communicate to you. But we know better than God. So, but all of these, what he did with Abraham, when Abraham went up on that mountain, and it's interesting because he said, the Lord will provide, that God will provide himself a sacrifice. And people say, oh, see, God said, I'll provide myself a sacrifice. And that's not what it says. That's reading the English version in a way and misinterpreting what God said. And if you want to know what it says, he said, Yirelo. Yirelo. He will see for himself. He will see to him. Aseh. And so, and that's significant. He did not say he will see himself said he will see for or see to himself. There's a preposition in the Greek text, in the Hebrew text, not Greek. There's a preposition, and it's not translated clearly in the King James text or any other that I know of. And people say, well, that was a Lamed preposition. That all it does, it indicates the object of the verb. No, it does not. If all God wanted was the object, he would have made it an object. Matter of fact, he has the S. I think he doesn't have a little word that he can put on something to make it clear that it's an object.
He does indeed.
He does indeed. So where are the minds? Where are the minds of the people who've been writing and digging into this stuff and preaching and teaching all of these things erroneously? You know where they are? They're in something besides what God actually wrote. And if you say, Brother Sheets, don't get so upset about it. You know what? Maybe you who are listening, you need to get upset about it. It's destroying people. People are going to the lake of fire because of people who don't teach properly and don't teach accurately. And they don't teach the person and nature of God and relate him to everything that exists. People are dying. I can tell you, it's why my dad committed suicide. It's why my brother-in-law committed suicide. It's why marriages are ending. It's why I saw something the other day where there was a news article, and I don't even know when it was. I didn't read it, but it was a news article about a young couple that had a baby born at home. So because they didn't want to keep the baby, they drowned the baby, the newborn baby, in the bathtub. Why? One aspect of why? Because we've got men that have been dilly-dallying and playing around with the truth instead of seeking what God actually said. You're playing church, doing church. And they're a bunch of, in so many respects, they are liars and false teachers because they're not accurately representing God. Any thoughts before we go? Very good. If you have a question or an issue or anything like that you'd like me to address, or regarding something I said, that's fine. Let me know by email, and I'll get this document sent out to you as well. So with that, we'll just say the Lord bless you, and may he do in your life what needs to be done, that you may walk with him more accurately. So, I forgot, Rebecca, you're the one's got to turn off the recording.
Sure thing.